The world was a symphony of gray. Gray dust from pulverized buildings coated her tongue. Gray, watery soup sloshed in her tin cup. The faces of the other women in the Luftwaffenhelferinnen, the female auxiliaries of the German Air Force, were a uniform gray of exhaustion and fear. What happens when the lie you live for collapses? Not slowly, but all at once. If you find these hidden stories of history fascinating, take a moment to subscribe and tell us where in the world you're watching from. For this story, her name is Anneliese. In the spring of 1945, she was 22 years old. For half her life, her reality had been shaped by one voice, crackling from every radio, echoing in every hall. The Führer's voice. The party's voice. She believed in German superiority. She believed in the coming victory. And she believed, with the certainty of faith, that the enemy was a hollow giant, ready to crumble. The Americans, they were a mongrel race of gangsters and cowboys, softened by jazz and decadent luxuries. Their society was starving, broken by a Great Depression from which it had never recovered. Joseph Goebbels had promised them this. It was a comforting truth as the sky above Hamburg turned to fire, day after day. But then the front line ceased to be a line. It became a street, a doorway. One damp April morning, the familiar whispers on her radio were drowned out by the roar and squeal of an American Sherman tank. Surrender was a blur, a chaos of English shouts and raised hands. The American soldiers were not the monsters from the posters. They were boys. Their faces were smudged with dirt, their movements weary. They chewed gum with an indifference that felt more insulting than cruelty. One of them, a sergeant with tired eyes, handed her a small olive-drab tin, a sea ration. Anneliese stared at it. Food was a reward, a tool of the state. It was earned, never given. She opened it. Inside sat a block of orange cheese and 2 hard biscuits. She took a bite. The flavor was a shock. It was sharp, intensely salty, and fatty. A richness she had not tasted in years coated her mouth. This single bite was more substantial than her entire week of official rations. It was the first crack in the foundation of her world. A small, absurd detail. A piece of cheese. The journey was a descent into the unknown. They were packed onto trucks, then trains, then a vast transport ship that smelled of sweat and seawater. For weeks, the only reality was the nauseating roll of the Atlantic. They were the enemy. They were prisoners. They expected starvation. They expected labor camps. They expected death. This was the promised fate of the vanquished. But the port was not a barren wasteland. It was New York. Even from the docks, the scale of it felt like a deliberate insult. The buildings did not scrape the sky. They pierced it. The air hummed with a vibrant, terrifying energy. After processing, they were loaded onto another train, this one heading south. The windows were blacked out, but through the small cracks, Anneliese caught glimpses of the forbidden land, and what she saw began to dismantle her world, piece by piece. The train left the industrial gray behind, and the world exploded into impossible color, a green so bright and lush it hurt her eyes. Not the dark, ancient green of a German forest, but an electric, living green that stretched to the horizon. This was farmland. But it was a fantasy. There were no shelled-out barns, no cratered fields. She saw geometric oceans of corn, so tall and dense they looked like a solid wall. She saw fields of wheat, glowing gold under a sun that seemed kinder here. She pressed her face to the crack, her mind reeling. Where were the starving masses Goebbels had spoken of? The farmhouses were perfect, painted white, each with a fat, shiny automobile parked outside. She saw colossal red barns and silos that stood like cathedrals built to honor grain. She saw herds of cattle, so numerous and healthy they looked like insects on a vast green carpet. This was not a country on the verge of collapse. It was a pantry, an endless, overflowing, impossibly abundant pantry, and it belonged to the enemy. The train rattled on, deeper into the heartland of the lie. With every mile, a terrifying question grew louder in her mind. It was no longer a question of if the propaganda was false. It was a question of how deep the deception went, and what other truths were waiting for her at the end of the line. Their destination was not a barbed wire wasteland. It was a former civilian conservation corps camp, nestled in the green heart of Alabama. The barracks were simple wood, not concrete bunkers. There were no watchtowers bristling with machine guns. There was only a fence, and beyond it, the endless, humming life of the American countryside. The work began at dawn. They were trucked to nearby farms. Their labor contracted out to replace the American sons who were fighting in Europe. The first day, Annalise was assigned to a vast peanut field. The plant itself was alien, a low green tangle in the red earth. The sun was relentless. The work was hard. But at midday, a farm truck rumbled to the edge of the field. It was not turnip soup. It was not gray bread. The guards handed each woman a thick sandwich, wrapped in wax paper. Inside were 2 slices of impossibly soft white bread. Between them, a thick, sticky brown paste. Annalise hesitated. She watched the others. They sniffed it, poked it. She took a tentative bite. The flavor was a bizarre collision. It was salty, then sweet, then deeply nutty. It coated the roof of her mouth, a strange and wonderful glue. Peanut butter. With it came a dark, curved glass bottle, sweating with condensation. Coca-Cola. In propaganda films, it was the symbol of American poison, a decadent brew for a weak people. She twisted the cap. A sharp hiss escaped. She drank. The liquid was a shock of cold, fizzing sugar. It was not poison. It was pure, childish delight. The abundance was a constant, grinding assault on her senses. She saw farmers tossing aside apples with a single bruise, apples that would have been a feast in Hamburg. She saw oceans of milk being loaded into trucks, more than her entire city had seen in a year. The numbers were a fantasy. International Red Cross reports, which she would only see later, confirmed the diet of a German POW in America averaged over 3,000 calories a day. Back home, her own mother's official ration was collapsing toward 1,000. One of the guards, a young corporal barely out of his teens, would sometimes listen to a portable radio. Strange music spilled out. It was chaotic, syncopated, full of wailing brass and insistent drums. Jazz, the degenerate music of an inferior race. But Annalise found herself listening. It sounded alive. It sounded free. It sounded like the country itself. The greatest shock came not from a new taste or sound, but from a piece of paper. A letter from her sister, delivered by the Red Cross. It was thin and brittle. The words were skeletal. Her sister wrote of the hunger, the constant, gnawing hunger. She wrote of spending a whole day searching for a single potato in the rubble. She wrote that their father had died, not from a bomb, but from dysentery caused by drinking unclean water. Annalise read the letter sitting under an oak tree, the Alabama sun warming her face. In her other hand, she held a bar of Hershey's chocolate, given to her by the farmer's wife as a simple gesture of thanks. The chocolate was sweet and smooth. Her sister's words were ash in her mouth. She, the prisoner, was living a life of unimaginable luxury. Her family, the free citizens of the Reich, were starving in the ruins of the lie she had served. The irony was a physical sickness. If this story is starting to challenge what you thought you knew about the war, hit that subscribe button and join us for more hidden histories. This was the true weapon, not the Sherman tank, not the flying fortress. It was the endless capacity of this place. While German factories were being pulverized, America, in 1944 alone, had produced over 96,000 aircraft. It had built more ships in 1 year than the entire Japanese Navy possessed. It had harvested so much grain that its silos were overflowing. The war, for America, seemed to be an inconvenience. For Germany, it had been annihilation. The other women felt it too. The certainty in their eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow confusion. They were prisoners of war, yet they were gaining weight. Their skin, once sallow, had color. They slept through the night, unafraid of the air raid siren's scream. One evening, watching the guards play a strange game involving a bat, a ball, and a lot of shouting, Annalise felt a cold terror creep into her heart. It was a thought so treasonous she barely dared to form it. She had been captured. She had been defeated. She had been stripped of her uniform and her purpose. And yet she had never felt safer. She had never been better fed. She had never been treated with such casual, indifferent humanity. Her captivity was more dignified than the freedom awaiting her at home. And she realized, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she did not want to go back. The re-education was not a formal process. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of their souls. It began on a warm Tuesday evening. The work was done. The women sat on hay bales, their stomachs full of cornbread and beans. A projector was set up, its beam cutting a cone of light through the twilight. This was not a Hollywood musical. The first images were silent, jerky, and black and white. They showed skeletons in striped pajamas. Piles of bodies, like discarded dolls, bulldozers pushing mountains of human remains into open pits. The names appeared on a title card. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Anneliese watched the faces of the American guards. They were not triumphant. They were grim, ashamed. A silence fell over the women, deeper than any they had ever known. The chirping of the Alabama crickets sounded obscene. Some women began to sob, a low, animal sound of pure grief. Others stared, their faces blank, refusing to connect the images to the nation they had served. One older woman, a former block warden from Berlin, stood up and screamed, "Judenpropaganda, Jewish lies." She screamed it over and over until two guards led her away, her voice cracking with a hysteria that was too wild to be faked. It was the sound of a mind choosing to break rather than bend. The next day, they were gathered in the mess hall. An American captain, a man who spoke flawless academic German, stood before them. He did not shout. He did not condemn. He used a chalkboard. He spoke of numbers. In 1944, he explained, the United States produced over 88,000 tanks. Germany produced less than 20,000. He wrote the numbers on the board. He spoke of steel. America had produced 90 million tons. The entire Axis war machine, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, had produced 30 million. He talked of oil, of aluminum, of merchant ships launched per week. It was not a lecture, it was an autopsy. He was calmly, methodically, explaining not just that they had lost, but that they could never have won. The war was not a contest of will or racial superiority. It was an equation, and they were on the wrong side of it. The knowledge settled like a poison. It seeped into the barracks, turning confusion into despair. Two women tried to hang themselves from the rafters with strips of bed linen. They were found in time. The camp doctor, a quiet man from Ohio, treated them with a gentle weariness. He could mend their bodies. He could not touch the ruin inside their heads. Anneliese felt her own mind fraying. Every belief was a lie. Every sacrifice was for nothing. The honor she clung to felt like a shroud. She received another letter from home. Her younger brother, just 17, had died on the Eastern Front, not in a heroic charge, but of typhus during the long retreat. Her mother's letter was a frantic collage of grief and slogans. He died for the Führer. His sacrifice will not be in vain. For the final victory. Anneliese read the words while sitting in a field of wildflowers. She held a cold bottle of milk in her hand, a gift from the farmer. The milk was pure and white. Her mother's words were black and rotten. The final victory. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. What victory? The victory of starving in a pile of rubble while believing in a ghost? That evening, a group of the most defiant women gathered in a corner of the yard. They began to sing, Die Feine Hoch, the Horst Wessel Lied, the anthem of the party. Their voices were thin, wavering, a desperate attempt to hold on to the world that had been vaporized by facts. Anneliese watched them. She felt nothing, no anger, no patriotism, just a vast, empty pity. She walked over to the woman leading the song, a fierce-faced woman named Ingrid, who had once been her superior. Ingrid's eyes flashed, expecting a challenge. Instead, Anneliese held out her hand. In it was a small square of chocolate she had been saving. She said nothing. The offer was a surrender. Not to the Americans, but to reality. It was an admission that the song was just noise, and the chocolate was real. Ingrid stared at the chocolate, then at Anneliese's face. Her voice faltered. The song died on her lips. A week later, the announcement came. The war in Europe was over. A roar went up from the American side of the camp. The guards cheered, hugged, passed around a bottle of whiskey. On the German side, there was only silence. It was official. They were the defeated. The camp commander announced that the process of repatriation would begin within the month. They were going home. Home. The The word was a stone in Annalise's stomach. She looked past the fence, not towards the east and the ruins of Hamburg, but west, across the endless, green, and prosperous American landscape. A prisoner's journey was supposed to end in freedom. But what if the prison was the only place you had ever been safe? What if the truth you had learned there made returning to the lies of home an impossible sentence? If these stories that challenge our understanding of the past are important to you, please consider subscribing and commenting below. What do you think is the greater prison? A fence you can see, or a lie you cannot? The journey home was the inverse of a nightmare. They were no longer traveling from a world of gray into one of impossible color. They were traveling back into the ash. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was not filled with the fearful whispers of the captured, but with a heavy, oppressive silence. The silence of the condemned returning to their sentence. Hamburg was not a city, it was a skeleton. As the ship eased into the devastated port, the women lined the rails. No one spoke. The skyline was a jagged row of broken teeth. The air, which in New York had hummed with life, here smelled of damp rot and cold stone. On the docks, the people were ghosts. Their faces were the color of the rubble they walked upon. Thin, spectral, their eyes hollowed out by more than just hunger. They were hollowed out by the collapse of the world. Annalise walked down the gangplank, a small sack in her hand. She was free. The word was meaningless. A guard in a tattered German uniform, now serving under British command, barely glanced at her papers. He was a boy, no older than her brother had been, and his face was a mask of weary resignation. She found the street where she had grown up. It was gone. In its place was a landscape of pulverized brick and twisted steel, a monument to a failed ideology. She eventually found her mother and sister living in a cellar, sharing the damp space with 2 other families. Her mother embraced her, a dry, rattling hug. Her sister, once vibrant, now looked 20 years older. Her eyes scanned Annalise's body. "You look healthy," she said. The words were not a compliment. They were an accusation. Annalise saw the ration on their small table. A few withered potatoes and a piece of dark bread that looked more like wood than grain. How could she speak of the things she had seen? How could she describe the taste of peanut butter to a sister who dreamed of a potato? How could she explain the casual abundance of a country that threw away more food in a day than this cellar would see in a month? To speak of it would be a cruelty, a treason against their shared suffering, so she said nothing. She shared their silence, she shared their hunger, and in doing so, she became a prisoner again, this time of a truth she could never tell. In the nights that followed, lying in the cold dark, she did not dream of the war. She did not dream of the bombs or the surrender. She dreamed of green, the impossible, electric green of an Alabama field. She dreamed of the sweet shock of a cold Coca-Cola on a hot day. She dreamed of the indifferent kindness of the farmer's wife who gave her a bar of chocolate, a simple gesture that had felt more profound than any medal for valor. She had been prepared for enemy cruelty. She had been trained to expect hatred, torture, and starvation. The propaganda had promised her a brutal foe. What it had never prepared her for was mercy. It had never prepared her for the devastating power of casual, thoughtless decency. Defeat in battle was a matter of honor. But to be defeated by a sandwich, by a simple act of humanity from the enemy you were taught to despise, that was a ruin from which the soul could never be rebuilt. She was free, in a land she no longer recognized, haunted by the memory of a beautiful prison. If these hidden stories of history have moved you, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you found most shocking about Annalise's journey.